Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to Live in the Wellness Garden. I am your garden coordinator, Andreas.
I am your student assistant, Anneli.
Today we're going to be talking about composting. Different composting methods that we employ here in the Wellness Garden, how they work, how you can do them in your own home, just sort of general tips and tricks about composting, an explanation of the composting process, what it is, how it works, and how you can make the most of it to produce wonderful compost in your garden, and also what is compost. While we wait for people to file in, we will give a brief tour of the Wellness Garden and how things are going. So here is our newer bed that we recently ran cover crops in. The beans are really starting to fill in, especially on this side. This row looks really good. Something came and hit this row right here. We did have some squirrel damage in this row, so it is a bit patchy, but this row looks fantastic. The flax didn't really come up, so we have a little bit right here, but it really does not seem to be a good companion for the beans. I think it's too small of a plant and it's getting shaded out by the beans, and that's good to know. So we know that for next time that we don't really want to grow flax with beans, but what we do know is that buckwheat grows well with beans, because these buckwheats are all volunteers and they're coming up alongside the beans and they're doing fantastic. So it's important to be an observer when you're in a garden, and it's important to try and ascertain what plants grow well together and what plants don't, so that we know what to pair, what plants to pair up. So this is valuable information. We're learning a lot from this bed right here in terms of what plants grow well together. So good stuff. So let's take a look over here. Mexican sunflower, we've been pruning that, cleaning it up. There's some kind of disease or something affecting the leaves. It's probably fungal, and it's most likely seasonal as well. The pigeon pea we cut back recently is doing great, starting to really branch out and grow rapidly. The sugar cane's been taking off quite a bit as well. Since it hasn't been too hot lately, a lot of the tropicals have been very happy, because tropical plants like hot, but not too hot. Everything else looks pretty great. Again, more tropicals thriving. Our achiro right here. We're going to be starting to get some tomatoes soon from the research plots. This one has a bit of a spider mite problem, but we've been working on it. Trying to avoid using the neem oil, but we do have neem oil as a last resort. This hydro system is doing well. Marigolds especially love to grow in hydroponics. So if you're looking to grow anything in hydroponics, like any kind of flower, grow marigolds. They don't seem to be very picky in terms of nutrient demands, and also they make beautiful flowers, and they're a wonderful companion plant that can help to attract beneficial insects. Turmeric coming up through here. Looking good. Turmeric does love the shade, so I think it's pretty happy being shaded out just a little bit by this zucchini. And as the weather begins to cool off a bit more, we get less sun hours and lower intensity sunlight, I think the turmeric will begin to shoot up a bit through the zucchini, provided nights don't get too cold. And we'll see about that. It is the valley and we do get cold nights. So the corn is done. We cut down the corn last week. We're going to let these zucchinis right here grow for a bit longer, because they are producing. Very exciting. These okra we are allowing to continue to grow, because we're going to harvest the seeds from these pods. Once the pods dry out, you can harvest the seeds and save them. Okra is very easy to grow from seed. Highly recommend growing okra if you like it. I like it. I think it's delicious. These tomatoes are doing well in here. They look very healthy, but I am not seeing any fruit set. So I'm not sure why that is at this point, because heat is no longer an issue. It's most likely a soil health / nutrient issue. So we'll see what happens, or it could just be that partially that this plant is still fairly young, it might need to get a little bit older before it really starts setting fruit. These tomatoes over here, the Matt's Wild Cherries, doing wonderful. Lots of fruit here. And this is probably the most forgiving tomato variety I've grown, Matt's Wild Cherry. It is a wild strain of tomato that is from Mexico. Got some more in here. we're gonna have lots of cherry tomatoes for food pantry. Moringa. The moringa looks incredible. We're going to be doing a harvest of the moringa tomorrow. Going to be donating some of that into the food pantry and utilizing the rest here at the Magrum Center. We're expecting quite the harvest because these moringa trees are easily like 15 feet tall. So they grow fast. Malabar spinach. Yeah. And of course we've got our Mediterranean herbs over here. Let's take a look at the seedlings that we started last week and how they're doing. Here they are. So right here we have our Minatina. Gotten close to 100% germination on the Minatina. The winter kale is doing great too. Not great germination on the lettuces. I'm not sure why that is, because my seeds should be in very good condition. Could have something to do with the weather patterns, who knows. And also in general, I haven't gotten the best germination in this particular table. Could be the location, could be a number of factors. But we're working on it. Here are the marigold seedlings that we showed during the last live. These will probably be ready to get transplanted within the next 2 weeks. I'm going to let them get to a rather large size before transplanting. Let's see if we're getting any roots on the bottom of the pot. Yeah, we sure are. Look at that. We're starting to get roots come out, so it might only be a week now then. Here's our hydroponic system. Mugwort is doing amazing. I love growing mugwort, and so is the chard. Mustard struggling a bit, but we just probably need to adjust the nutrients a little. And of course, we have lots of cherry tomatoes right here. Really excited about the cherry tomatoes. I want to leave them going for a bit longer, even though I've been saying I want to turn this bed over into cover crops. So we'll leave them a bit. Anyways, let's begin getting into the main subject of the video, but more on tomatoes. The aquaponic tomatoes are going absolutely crazy. Still, even though there's no fish in the system right now. They're just running off of residual nutrients and a little bit of hydroponic nutrients I put in there, organic nutrients. So,
Some in the back are already turning red.
oh, are they?
Yeah, like,
Oh yeah, they are. Look at that. Yeah, it's going to be time to start harvesting these. Really excited for that. I love growing tomatoes in aquaponics. All right, look at that sky. Partly cloudy today. Anyways, we're gonna get started with the main subject of the video, which is composting. So I'm gonna set up our camera right here, and we're going to demonstrate one of our main composting systems right here. This is our tumbler right here. So how it works is you turn this crank right here, and it causes the entire bin to tumble. And that is what turns the compost. So, you may be asking right now, what is compost? Well, let's imagine for a moment that we're in a forest, right? And we're digging through the leaf litter on the forest floor. So, you might be able to dig through the leaf litter for a couple inches. We'll use the wood chips as an analog right here. So you might be able to dig through the litter for a couple inches until you find this material sitting on top of the soil that's really dark and rich looking. And this right here is pretty much what we're creating when we're composting. What we're doing is we're taking material that was once alive, that mainly has come from plants, so mainly vegetative material, and we're utilizing or partnering with the microbes and fungi that will break down this living material or biomass or whatever you want to call it in a forest environment or in a grassland environment or in like any kind of litter layer in a natural ecosystem. It's the same biology, and we can utilize this biology to compost our garden trimmings. We could use this biology to compost our food scraps. We could use this biology to compost paper, napkins, to break it down into this material called compost. So that's what composting is. We're breaking down this material using the action of these microbes, fungi, and other organisms that normally break down organic wastes and detritus in a more natural setting, especially a forest. That's how forest soil is built. You have the leaves and the branches fall onto the ground, the bacteria and fungi consume them, and the end result is essentially compost. It's pretty much the same material. So there are many different ways we can make composts that have different characteristics, and we use different methods for these. And so for the tumbler, we're making a type of compost called hot compost, and this is not usually a kind of compost that you can find in a more natural setting. Hot compost can really only be produced in a controlled environment. And basically what we're doing in hot compost is we're creating conditions for a very large amount of biological activity, for a very large amount of bacteria and fungi to grow inside of our compost pile. In order to do that, we need really two things besides our compostables. We need nitrogen and oxygen, because all of our compostable materials contain carbon. And what we're doing when we compost is we're turning this carbon into a form that is stable in soil, called humus. That's one of the main components of compost, is humus, is these stable carbon-containing compounds that can last for hundreds of years in soil sometimes. So that's what we're making when we're making compost. We're making humic materials to a large extent. There's other stuff in compost too. There's some soluble nutrients, but a lot of it is really just like these aggregates of organic material that contain these humates. So what we need in order to form that is we need a fuel source. And there are two kinds of fuel two main kinds of fuel for these life forms that engage in the composting process, that actually break down and compost the material: oxygen and nitrogen. Both of these things are found in the atmosphere, but nitrogen is not normally directly available to these life forms from the atmosphere. So the nitrogen, how we get nitrogen into our pile is with leafy material, like these sweet potato vines right here. Green leafy material, not brown leafy material, green material. So these are our greens right here. And there are many things that are considered greens, not just leaves. We have these handy dandy little signs right here. I don't think we have the sign with greens and browns. We just have the do's and don'ts, and we'll use these, but greens. Greens would be leafy material, food scraps, anything that contains a lot of nitrogen, coffee grounds, and they have a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So more nitrogen proportionally to the amount of carbon, basically. And then we have our brown materials, which are high in carbon. So like anything that's like dry and brown, whether it's leaves or what, because green in leafy material signals the presence of nitrogen. That's where green actually comes. A lot of the green actually comes from. It's from the chlorophyll, which contains nitrogen. So we know that if our leaves are green, then they contain nitrogen, because there's nitrogen in the chlorophyll molecule. But our browns, like this dried up corn leaf, will not have a lot of nitrogen in them. And another example of browns would be these wood chips right here. These are browns. Anything that's very woody, not a lot of nitrogen in it. Wood is mainly composed of cellulose and lignin, which are very rich in carbon and not very rich in nitrogen. So these are our browns, and it's that carbon that we're trying to stabilize when we're composting. And when we stabilize the carbon, we can stabilize a lot of the other nutrients, and also create this substance that contains a lot of spores of those beneficial microorganisms, because these beneficial microorganisms that compost our waste also have a part to play in the soil food web, and they're very important in our soil microbiome. So we're talking bacteria, fungi, many kinds of beneficial nematodes, small single-celled organisms, really tiny invertebrates like mites, worms, everything. Everything that you'll find in soil, or a lot of the things that you find in soil, you'll find in compost and participate in the composting process. So we're going to open this up. And so when it comes to our greens to browns or carbon to nitrogen, we roughly want the same amounts by volume of green and brown material. And we've been building this pile right here, and you can see it's kind of like a mix of green and brown material. So we have some green stalks right here, some brown stalks. And we've kind of chopped it up. What we achieve by chopping up this material, as Anelli is doing here, is we're increasing the surface area. We're increasing the edge. We're increasing the amount of surfaces that the bacteria and fungi can colonize and begin to consume. So this will allow the composting process to proceed more quickly. In addition, what we're doing is we are... Sorry, I hear a sound on the hydroponic system. What is that? I'll have to figure that out later. In addition, what we are doing is we are increasing the amount of pore space, the amount of air gaps in our compost pile. And this is important for allowing the oxygen in. So oxygen will diffuse passively into the compost pile, into the compost. So oxygen from the atmosphere will just sort of seep in through all these pores and cracks. But once we activate the pile and it begins composting, we're going to want to add more oxygen to it. And the way that we do that is by turning it, by moving this lever and rotating the barrel around and around to mix the materials around. So this compost pile is not active yet. So yeah, what we're doing is we're adding our browns and greens. We're trying to get the ratio of greens to browns even, because this is how you achieve the proper carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you have too much nitrogen, then your compost pot, then the biology will multiply too quickly. They'll be producing too much heat, because when bacteria and fungi, especially bacteria, consume these materials, they will produce waste heat from their metabolic processes, and this will cause the compost to begin to heat up. And if it heats up too hot, then a lot of that beneficial biology is going to start to die off, and we're going to start to have issues with nutrient loss. We're going to start to have issues with the kinds of biology that we don't want to have, the anaerobic microbes. This will create smells and compounds that are toxic to plants, and then our batch of compost might go bad. So we don't want to add too much greens. And if we don't add enough greens and we add too much browns, then the composting process will progress very, very slowly. It'll be more fungally dominated, so we won't have as much bacteria. And this is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the type of compost you want to produce and what you're going to be using it for. And we'll get into that in a second. But if you don't have a lot of green material in there, then it's going to break down very slowly, and the material is going to be consumed more by fungi, and fungi will have more of an opportunity to move in and multiply, because it's fungi that actually decompose the lignified material, the really tough woody material. And bacteria like to decompose things that are not as tough, and they can help to break down the tougher material if they have enough nitrogen. I guess it depends. Like, what are you going to use this compost for? So if you're doing a hot compost is most likely going to be very bacterial, and that means it's going to be good for your vegetable crops. A cold compost that does not have a lot of green material added, and we'll show you guys our cold compost pile, will be really good for tree crops, because trees like really fungally dominated soil, and vegetables like prefer soil that is more bacterially dominated. So that's kind of like, a rundown of green and brown materials, carbon to nitrogen ratios, and fungal versus bacterial compost. So just a quick overview. So green materials are materials that contain a lot of nitrogen. So for example, your leafy material, your food scraps, your coffee grounds, all that stuff that will get really smelly typically when it's left to rot, that's green material. So when you smell that rotting smell, that is caused by anaerobic bacteria, the bacteria that we do not want to have in our compost. And it's really just a lack of oxygen and like a lack of proper moisture. Because if something is too wet, you won't be able to get enough oxygen. And if something is not being aerated in turn, and it's very high in nitrogen, you won't have enough oxygen. So then you'll have anaerobic bacteria proliferating. And then we have our brown materials, which are very high in carbon and not very high in nitrogen. And when you're making a compost pile, the general rule of thumb is you want equal amounts by volume of green and brown materials. And this will create the conditions for a good compost, provided you turn it enough. If you want a compost with a higher fungal rate, a higher population of fungi, so a lower bacterial to fungal ratio, I guess, then you're going to want to use more brown material, especially wood chips. Fungi love wood chips, and this fungal compost is really good for trees. Another thing you could do is make compost out of leaves called leaf mold. And when you're making a more fungal compost, you don't want to turn it and aerate it as frequently, or at all. But if you're making a bacterial compost, because bacteria can withstand the mechanical forces put on the compost by turning it, and fungi cannot. So with a bacterial compost, we can turn it frequently, and we want to keep turning it in order to maintain adequate oxygen levels so it does not go anaerobic. So basically, have a proper carbon to nitrogen ratio, know what kind of compost you're making and what you're using it for, and make sure that you're turning it frequently enough. And you will know from the temperature and from the smell. And this is something that we can observe. So there's one more thing that we need to initiate the composting process that we have not added to here yet, and that is water. All life needs water to live, and composting is a biological process. Therefore, in order for the process to work, there needs to be enough moisture available. And so when you're building a pile like this, we're building this pile right now, you don't want to add any water because that'll begin to activate the composting process. It's like you're burning a candle. Like, I would say a candle is a good analogy, because if you want to burn a candle and create a light source and then, have light at the end of the day, our light is our compost, then you need to light the candle. And the way we light the candle in composting is by adding water. So we're going to begin adding more of these green materials to the bin, and then we are going to add water to initiate the process. I don't think there's anything in here because we did harvest a bunch of compost recently. Yeah, this is all material that already went through the process. These are the siftings, because we already sifted what was in this bin. This was a complete batch, and this material has dried out. We can actually see the fungi on here. You see that? That's mycelium. That's what the fungi look like. And since this material has been sitting and hasn't been disturbed, we've been getting some fungal blooms. And this material right here is very rich in a lot of the biology that made the compost that was in here prior. So you need to have the biology present, the microbes, the fungi, all those organisms present in order to initiate the composting process. I mean, the thing is, this biology is everywhere, on the surface of every leaf, on the surface of all of your food items that you eat. You just can't see it. And in many circumstances, all you really have to do is add water to initiate the process and to awaken the biology. But if we want to produce a higher quality compost product, what we'll do is we'll take some of this material as we're building our pile from a previous pile and sprinkle it in. Because this has the biology that made compost before on it, the microbes that made compost before on it. So by adding this material back to our new pile, we're inoculating it with that biology that made a successful pile in the past. And so this is a good way to produce higher quality compost and to make sure that the process initiates properly. Because while there may be microbes on pretty much everything, sometimes you might not have enough microbes, you might not have the right kinds of microbes, and so adding this material that was made from the previous pile, this material that did not fully break down, this material that has all this biology on it still, this mother, as we call it, sort of like the mother of a kombucha, we can start a new pile with it, and we can get similar results and a compost of similar quality. Now, as you add more and more materials from different sources to your compost, you're going to be introducing more biology over time. So as long as you continue to compost and continue to add new material and more material to your piles, you will end up with higher and higher quality compost over time, generally speaking. If you don't have enough biology, if you don't have enough microbes around, and you're just starting a pile, you can purchase them. You can wild collect them. A lot of people purchase products. I don't believe in purchasing compost starting products, but you can do it. It's just my personal opinion. I've never found them to be necessary. You could just take compost from another person's pile and use it as your mother. That's totally fine. You can even, there are even ways to go out and collect wild biology and use that. I've done that too. That is something that is worth looking into. But you also can purchase these products that contain this pre-formulated mixture of effective microorganisms, or EM, and use that as a compost starter. Because the microbes that initiate the composting process and nutrient cycling in soil, because they're many of the same groups, there's a lot of overlap, are oftentimes called effective microorganisms. So we'll refer to them as EM for the remainder of the live stream. But you can buy the EM, you can get the EM from another pile, and you can also collect the EM from the wild. So yeah, so we have all of our ingredients now to create a compost pile. We have green materials in here. We have brown materials already in here. We have a hose with water that is able to have water, and we have oxygen in the air. So once we initiate the pile, we're going to wait for it to heat up. And once it heats up to a certain temperature, we want it to be, I think, around 140 degrees. We'll turn it in the center, because it'll heat up the most in the center. So why does a compost pile heat up? Again, it's because our EM, our microorganisms, as they break down and digest the material, generate heat. When you go for a run, does your body temperature go up or down? It goes up because your metabolism is working. You're burning calories. These microbes are burning calories when they are composting. Therefore, some of those calories will be released into the environment as waste heat, and this causes the pile to heat up. So we want to maintain our sort of optimum temperature range of, and I don't know all the details. You can look this up, the temperatures for composting. You want to maintain 160 degrees for a certain number of days. I think it's a couple of days if you're doing hot composting. And then have longer periods of 130 to 140 degrees. You know, all this information is available, and you know, some people are very serious about composting and treat it like a surgical operation, and you can do that. I don't do that. I'm just like, okay, is this hot or is this cold? Is this warm? Like, do I need to turn it? How does it smell? How does it look? That's how I tend to do it. I tend to use my senses and observations. Some people like to use instruments, but you want to have a hot compost pile like this that you turn frequently heat up to 160 degrees for a couple days. And what that's going to do is it's going to kill weed seeds and it's going to kill diseases. So rule of thumb when it comes to materials. So diseased material. Let's look at a diseased plant. This is blight. This is a disease that affects tomatoes. Here's an even better one. Should we put this in the compost? Well, I know for a fact that this tumbler is not going to get hot enough to kill that blight, so we're not going to put it in. So you can dispose of diseased material, or what I like to do is just use it around plants that won't get the disease, like fruit trees, for example. So fruit trees don't get blight, so I just throw them at the base of the fruit trees as a mulch. I'm not sure if you want to do that. That's what I do. I have not had any issues with that, but please exercise caution. Anyways, yeah, so again, don't add diseased material to the compost unless you know what that disease is and know for a fact that your pile is going to get hot enough to kill that disease. Same thing goes with weeds. Do not add any weeds that may contain seeds or may contain parts that can propagate themselves to your pile unless you know it's going to get hot enough to kill those weeds. And this one is not going to get hot enough, so we're not going to add that stuff. I'm going to take a water break, and Anelli is going to continue continuing to chop up this material. These are some passion fruit vines, and I'll be right back. Okay. So we are back. So this is just one method of composting, using a tumbler like this. And you don't have to use a tumbler to create a hot compost pile, but it definitely saves you a lot of work. Because normally what a lot of people will do for a hot compost pile, and let's go over here to our cold pile. Because a lot of people use this system here for hot composting. There's our moringa again. Wow, look at that. Huge trees. All this growth from here to here, to the very top, has been since around April, May. Moringa is crazy. Definitely grow moringa. Here's our cold pile. So a lot of people will use bins like this for hot composting, and you actually have to physically turn it every couple days, because when you compost using a hot composting method, there are various different sub methods. Like there's the Berkeley method, and there are a couple others. You will need to turn it every couple of days, and that's a lot of work. So the tumbler, of course, is a way to save us labor, because all we have to do is turn the crank and it turns the bin. Super easy, makes it super easy. I find that you don't get as good of a quality compost with the tumbler system, but it does make decent compost. Or you can have these sort of bins right here to keep your materials in as they compost. And you can turn them manually from a bin like this using a pitchfork. I like to use a pitchfork and a shovel. And then what you'd have is you'd have one or more bins that you would then move the material into bit by bit. So shovel full or pitchfork full by shovel full or pitchfork full until it's all been transferred to the bin, and that oxygenates it, that aerates it. And as you're doing it, you'll usually be watering it to make sure that the moisture levels are optimal. But in this case, what we're doing is we just put a bunch of material in here and it's just sitting in here. So that's what cold composting is. When you just combine all your materials together, keep them moist, and let them sit. And normally you don't want to use as much greens in cold composting. So like what we use in our cold compost pile oftentimes is we just kind of throw everything in here that isn't diseased. So this is just material that was used for seed starting. These are some lavender stems. We didn't really break anything down, and you don't really have to. It'll just go to the truck to pass. It'll just help the process progress more efficiently and more quickly. But all you have to do in this case really is just keep things moist for cold composting, and they'll break down. And you can see right here we're starting to get a pretty good material right here. And I'll show you guys what we want the end product to look like. But cold composting is easier. You don't have to turn it, and you just kind of want to layer things and let them sit there. You will put some greens in here and some and more browns, and you'll layer them like lasagna, and then you'll just water them and keep watering them, keep checking the moisture, and just let it sit. Cold composting usually takes 6 months to a year. Hot composting takes as little as 18 days to a couple months. Depends on your method, depends on your carbon to nitrogen ratios, depends on how frequently you're turning the pile, and it depends on how well you're able to maintain your moisture levels. Those are the things that affect how quickly the composting progresses, and of course the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So again, carbon, browns, nitrogen, greens, same thing for all intents and purposes. Every material has its own carbon to nitrogen ratio that we can use in a compost pile. Like wood chips are 500 to 1, and then like grass clippings are like 17 to 1. And if you want to get super precise and scientific about it and produce compost in a very controlled manner, then you can combine ingredients in certain proportions depending on their exact carbon to nitrogen ratios, but home gardeners really don't need to do that. We can just consider our green materials to be greens and our brown materials to be considered browns. And it's as simple as that if you're just doing it at home. So yeah, this is cold composting, and this one's been sitting for a while. And how this bin kind of works and how we're managing it is we'll add our materials on top, we'll water it, and then they'll break down slowly. We just keep on adding materials and adding materials. They'll break down, and as soon as we get to the bottom, eventually we'll have this end product. Let's see if I can find some stuff that looks pretty good, because we did take a bunch recently. So I want to make sure we have something that I can show you guys. Oh yeah, we do. Perfect. Lots of ants in here. And so this is our end product. This is compost, right here. This is compost. What does it look like? It looks like good soil that is swarming with life. It looks crumbly, like chocolate cake. It's well aggregated, like healthy soil. This is basically topsoil that we built right here. That's pretty much what compost is. It's topsoil. And we use it as a soil amendment. And it does have nutrients. It's not particularly nutrient dense. You know, we'll add some nutrients back by composting for sure. But one of the main benefits that we're getting from a good compost is lots and lots of biology. Lots and lots of those little life forms that live in it. Most of them being the ones that you can't see. But we do have things like this. Check out this little guy right here. This is a millipede. They are involved in the composting process. They're shredders. They rip up and physically, mechanically reduce the size of a lot of our materials that we added to our pile. And then the fungi and the bacteria do like a lot of the chemical work that is required for composting, as opposed to the mechanical work. But yeah, this is our end product, and we can apply it as a soil amendment, and it's great stuff. I think that compost is the best amendment you can apply to your soil. Nothing beats compost, in my opinion. So yeah, that's what compost looks like, and that is our cold pile. Let's cover that back up, and let's check in on a Nelly and have a look at our worm farm. But those are the two main methods of composting: hot composting and cold composting. And again, you know, hot composting will produce a product that is better for a vegetable garden. Oh, hey, monarch butterfly, hello. Beautiful. And cold composting will produce a product that is better for your tree crops and for your perennials. So let's see how we're doing here. How are we doing in Ellie? Yeah, so we want to chop up our material nice and fine. That's one way to do it with the just the bypass pruners, and I can show you guys another way. You can also use these. Our loppers, as we like to call them. Just go in here and you see we're getting size reduction already. So the more you reduce the average size of the individual particles of our green material, of the individual pieces, the more compressed it'll become. So that's another thing that happens during the composting process. We get size reduction. Because not only does a lot of the water become removed from the material during the composting process, and finished compost will be moist, but the particle size gets reduced from like these huge leaves down to those tiny little grains that look like that are about the size of grains of sand or a bit bigger, that I showed you guys earlier. And so this will really help get everything mixed up, because you'll get better mixing as well when you have smaller particle size. And see, we've already reduced the volume by almost half just by doing this. Alright. So this is a pretty good green material for us to add right here, these passion fruit leaves. Alright, so let's take a look at the worm farm. I'm going to pull it out. Right here. All right. Go over here. There's another way to compost that we have not yet talked about. And this is one of my favorite ways, actually, because it's easy and it produces a better quality than the tumbler or the cold compost pile. And it is considered a method of cold composting, but it has many of the benefits of hot composting. and it produces a higher quality product at the end. This is a vermicomposting system, also known as a worm farm, and it is also the easiest way to compost in very small spaces. So I think we actually need to add water to this one. But see, we added some green materials. We're going to add more, and then we have this material underneath that looks like finished compost. But what did all this? Let's dig through. Let's see if we can find some of our buddies in here. We have worms. Red wigglers. Red composting worms. So this is a system that is designed as a worm habitat. This is a worm house right here. That's what this is. And worms are some of the best composters around. They're compost producing factories essentially. So worms will help to break the material down into smaller pieces, and then when the material passes through the guts, a lot of our pathogens are eliminated, and they have a lot of beneficial microbes in their gut, which will help to process down the material further. So the end result is a product that is very high quality, very clean, and very high in nutrients. And worm castings actually are a bona fide fertilizer as well, and not just a compost. So this is a pretty cool system. So we have this upper level right here. We have this lower level right here. And so a lot of the castings will fall down into here or to the very bottom level. So this is our product that's really finished right here. You can see this is the best compost that we make here on site. And we do like to use these as a fertilizer. So when it comes to your worm farm, pretty much the same rules apply. You want to maintain an even carbon to nitrogen ratio. You want to keep it moist. And that's pretty much it. Then all you have to do in a worm farm is just keep adding materials and keep the surface covered. There's nothing else to it. It's the easiest method to compost. You can do it. It's one of the easiest composting methods. You can do it in extremely small spaces. I mean, just look at how small this worm farm is, and that means you can do it indoors. If you're managing your worm farm properly, it will not smell. Well, the main cause of smells in a worm farm is A, it's not oxygenated enough, or B, you're adding too many greens. So, the only disadvantage is, in general, you don't really want to add materials to a worm farm that are too tough. We prefer to add food scraps and less tough materials like these sweet potato leaves right here. So, same rules apply. We want to break these down. Yeah. So we're going to process these inside of this bin right here. And we need to be careful not to cut up the bin when using this. But yeah, it has been said, I've heard somewhere, I don't remember where, that a lot of our harmful and disease-causing organisms in our gardens will be eliminated within the digestive tracts of the worms. And so and don't quote me on this, I need to verify this information, but the claim that I've heard is that you're pretty much guaranteed, if you're doing worm composting properly, to end up with a clean product that you can use without being concerned about spreading disease in your garden. Because composting is a great way to spread disease in your garden if you're not doing it properly, and if you're adding disease materials to your bin. That's certainly not something you want to do. It's like a salad. And sweet potato leaves are edible. I've tried them. They're kind of astringent. They're probably better if cooked, but you can't eat them fresh. I'm sure our worms will love them too. So this is a pretty hefty amount of green material. So we may actually want to add some browns in here. So let us begin adding our greens, and I just kind of like to layer them in. Yeah, it's that noise again. That's a pump running dry. So as soon as we're off the live, I need to address that. But, so we'll begin adding our greens in. I think that's enough. We don't want to add any more than that. Let's add our greens.
Just enough to cover it.
Yep. Let's see if I can. I know there are some browns in here. There are too many browns in this pile right now. Let's add some browns. So the one thing that vermicomposting does not get rid of is weed seeds. And we did see as we opened the pile the worm farm, that there were some seeds germinating. So I don't expect to get rid of weed seeds with the worm farm. Only hot composting can do that. So if you want to compost weeds, use hot composting and be very diligent about it. Okay. So we have our materials. Now consider that those sweet potato leaves are mostly water, so they will lose a lot of water, and that's like a pretty good ratio right there. So now what we want to do is add water, because that's what initiates the process, even for the worms. Worms breathe through their skin, and in order for them to breathe, their skin needs to be moist. So we need to continually add water. Just make sure that it's moist. You don't want to keep, it's not like you want to keep it sopping wet. You want to keep it just moist, like a wrung out sponge. Because if it's sticky or wet, then you're creating the conditions for those anaerobic organisms that cause diseases and that produce toxins and that you don't want to have. So when you water a worm farm, the bottom barrel, or the bottom bin right here, because this is a 3-layer system, is going to catch this liquid. And this liquid is called leachate. And some of this liquid will be produced on its own, just by the vermicomposting process. And some people like to use this on their plants and others don't. It can get anaerobic. If it smells bad, don't use it. Your nose is your best indicator of the health of something in your garden. If it smells bad, then it is bad. So we add some water. I think we should add a little bit more. Not too much. We just want to moisten it, that's all. And now the worms are going to have a feast. And so with a worm farm, so what don't worms like? Worms don't like heat, and worms don't like light. So to exclude the light, we're going to cover it. And to keep out the heat, we're either going to place it indoors or in full shade. I find that in Southern California, it is okay to keep a worm farm in full shade. Even if it's 110 degrees out, they'll be okay. That's my personal experience. I know there are others who have not had that experience. But I personally don't have any issues with keeping a worm farm outdoors as long as it is completely shaded. Worms, I think, do best when temperatures are between 55 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you can do it indoors, do it indoors. Room temperature is great. Oh wow, 15% battery already. So this is where we like to keep our worm farm. It's not full shade, but it's shady enough to where it's like, okay, we're, able to, the worms are not in too bad shape. And we do have leachate now. So let's collect that. Let's collect our leachate. See, there it comes. Yeah, that works. Is there a hole in the bottom?
No, but it's like something down there.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Just tilt the worm farm. Just tilt it.
Okay.
And then we're going to see how it smells. If it smells bad, we're not going to use it. Alright, that's good for now. Let's see. And see, there's some castings here. Normally it's just like a liquid, but because a lot of the castings fell to the bottom. So let's smell this. Doesn't smell like anything. And those bubbles, oftentimes when you see bubbles, they're from microbe activity. It's from a lot of the substances that are being produced by the microbes. So where should we put this then? How about one each for each fig tree? So we're going to give the larger amount to the weaker fig tree. And again. Oh, that's the good stuff. You see how it's turning brown?
Yeah.
That's the good stuff. A lot, eh? Give this to this big tree. And the next thing that we're going to do is initiate the composting process here. And we don't want to leave a bunch of leachate in the bottom of our worm farm because then it will go anaerobic. That's a guarantee. Whenever you have a lot of nutrients and not enough oxygen, you're creating the conditions for anaerobic bacteria. So, oh wow, I just noticed that. Talk about beneficial organisms. Look at all of that mycelium on there. These are fungi. Not all fungi produce mushrooms. A lot of them don't. They just make this mycelium, but this is the fungal network on here. Again, fungi have more of a role to play in cold composting systems as opposed to hot systems. And then they will have a role to play in vermicomposting as well. Okay. Hit that a bit more. I think that's good. If it's just a little bit, then enough oxygen will be able to get in. But that is our leachate. I've gotten some pretty stinky leachate before. The smells that you don't want to have are the smell of vomit, the smell of sulfur, and the smell of dead things. Those are the three big smells that you don't want to smell. And there's only like, I'd say there are two good smells. 2 or 3. The smell of vinegar and like the smell of like soil, of earth. So vinegar is usually a good smell. It's not a big deal. And like that earthy aroma that if you ever like pick up a handful of soil in the forest and smell it, that earthiness, that's the best smell for sure. And see, these things smell good to us. Our noses have evolved to smell healthy soil versus unhealthy soil. Good compost versus bad compost. Because the bad stuff can make us sick too. The bad smells can make us sick too. It's our body telling us, you know, this is no good. Don't use this, don't eat this, don't put this in your body, don't put this in your garden. Trust your nose. Anyways, we have one more method of composting to talk about because we're actually going to be wrapping up soon. But yeah, so we're going to keep building this pile really quick. We're going to add in this green material. You want to make sure it's well mixed. And I don't think this pile is going to be ready to start yet. But all we're going to do to start it is we're going to water it and then turn it, and then water it and then turn it, and then water it and then turn it several times. So let's add in half of those. Let's mix them up. You want everything to be well mixed. You want your greens and your greens and browns to contact each other, to get to know each other, so that the microorganisms can then begin utilizing the nitrogen in the greens to break down the carbon in the browns. So we added some material. Let's then add some of our mother. I like to do layer of greens, layer of browns, then mother. Or like in any configuration, it doesn't really matter. Again, more of that mycelium. I think this is a banana peel, but you see how it dried out and then it didn't fully break down? So more of our mother. Cool. Mix it a bit more. And this usually takes about 2 months. And I am not very fond of the compost that the tumblers make. I find that when it comes to hot composting, it's better to like actually have a pile that you physically turn and mix. But you know, the stuff that's come out of here is really not that bad. It's like we've been growing good crop with it. So I mean, if you don't have a lot of time to turn a pile completely by hand, or you don't want to put all that effort into doing that because it's just too much work for you, this is a good option. Now, I've used another system called a Johnson Su bioreactor. That is like a combination of hot and cold. It's a hot pile at first, and then it turns into a cold pile, and that's the method that I prefer, but we don't have one of those here. But Johnson Su bioreactors produce the highest quality compost, and it's also a no-turn system. The highest quality compost that I've personally seen. Anyways, we have one last composting method to talk about. So we talked about our worm farm. We talked about our tumbler, our hot composting system, and then over there we talked about our cold composting bin. Now we're going to talk about the easiest method to compost of all, and probably the best for building healthy soil in your garden. It's called composting in situ, and that's what we've been doing a lot of here. So one example of composting in situ, chop and drop. Take a lot of your leafy materials that you prune and just lay them on top of the soil around other plants. These are our support species that we are growing for more of this leafy material and for more of this biomass to use for soil building in composting in situ. So chop and drop is composting in situ. We've been experimenting with that in between our veggie rows. And so instead of adding all of these compostables to a pile, we've just been laying them down on top of the soil in between our vegetables in layers. And you can see, as long as we keep it moist, the biology is starting to attack this material. The discoloration that you're seeing right there is from microorganisms. This discoloration, that's fungus. That's fungus right there. And it's breaking down the material. And so as we get to the bottom, we can see more organisms. Let me get like a better angle right here so you can see more. And these are our crop residues from around the garden, from the cover crops, from everything. You can see more. So, and see this right here is our compost that we're producing right here. This actually produces topsoil. And you can see we have our roly-polies in here. They're another organism that you'll find in compost is the wood lice, the roly-polies. Various insects, springtails, centipedes, millipedes, beetles. I get lots of beetles in my composting piles and all that good stuff. So this is composting in situ. So now all we have to do is do a layer of greens, do a layer of browns, do a layer of greens, do a layer of browns, keep them moist. And we've been using these micro sprinklers to keep them moist in the beds. So we're composting in place. We're composting in situ. That's what this is. And it is the easiest way to do it, and in my opinion, it's the best. Now, when it comes to this, do not use materials that have weed seeds, and do not have materials that are diseased. Use materials that are diseased. Never, ever, ever, ever with this method. But it is extremely, this is a great method for building soil. You can also do it using a method called sheet composting, where you build up a really tall layer of these compostable materials and then just let them break down for a couple of months. That's a great way to build topsoil. That is something I've done in my garden and can highly recommend, so check out sheet composting. So this is composting in situ, where you're just adding your materials directly to the soil surface in the right ratios. Ratios are important here too. So if you add a lot of browns, you'll get a fungal soil. If you add a mix of green and browns, you'll get a more bacterial soil. So we've added a mix of green and browns here, and a lot of the materials did turn brown, but under here we put lots of greens. And that material broke down, and the roots are already going for it. So I would say this composting in situ was a success, but that's how you do it. You just layer your materials. You can chop them up if you want. We don't have anything here we can use to chop the materials very finely, so I find it's better to just sort of like lay them down and keep them organized. It's just a lot of work to chop up the materials finely using the bi-press pruners and the loppers. We would need like some kind of shredder or mulcher. But even like when it comes to composting in situ, just like leaving the pieces large, it works. It's fine. They will just break down a bit more slowly. You might want the materials to break down more slowly if you want to keep your soil covered for longer, or if you don't have as many materials available, or you might want them to break down more quickly if you need to add more fertility to your soil, and you have a lot of materials available. But for this composting in situ, as I mentioned, and this is a subject of a future live, we do grow plants specifically to add on top of our soil for this process, specifically to add as a chop and drop so that they can compost in place. So here we have our Mexican sunflower. This is one of them. It contains a lot of our primary nutrients. The NPK of the dried down leaves, I believe, is 314. So fantastic material for adding. Is really good at scavenging nutrients from poor soil. Mexican sunflower. Right here we have our pigeon pea. This one is able to fix nitrogen directly from the atmosphere, and we use this one to get to work nitrogen into our system, because the Mexican sunflower is not capable of fixing nitrogen. For the most part, it is utilizing nitrogen reserves already present in the soil. This is generating its own nitrogen from the air, using the help of beneficial bacteria that live in association with the plant's roots. So these are both very fast-growing plants. This Mexican sunflower we planted in late May from a cutting about 10 inches long, and you can see how big it's gotten. We've already cut it back several times. Pigeon pea is from seed, about the same age. And anything from seed will take longer to get big, but this one will get big. We have a couple over here that are over a year old. And so when it comes to these types of plants that you can use for composting in situ, for chop and drop, you can use them in a regular compost pile as well. So here's our older pigeon peas. These are a year old. And we've cut these back probably 5 times this year. So you'll get a lot of greens from these. And both of these, any kind of leaf material you get from one of these biomass plants is considered a green, and the woody material is more of a brown. Another one that we've been employing are sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes. This is also a vegetable, and the pigeon peas do produce an edible, like bean sort of thing. But yeah, another one is the Jerusalem artichoke. We've cut this one back several times as well. These are only a season old, and we also have been using sunflowers for this purpose. So I can just show you guys really quick how I've cut back the sunflowers. You can see, like, I just topped them right here, and then they're sending out new shoots. These ones I think I'm going to remove entirely soon, but then I'll just chop them and drop them and lay them on top of here. Composting in situ. They will break down, they will cover the soil and protect it from the elements, and when they break down, all those nutrients will get released into the soil, and all the organic matter is going to get released into the soil. And this is physically building the soil back up and cycling nutrients back into the bed. So this is, at this point, you know, we're not only composting on the bed, but we're subbing out our fertilizers. Anyways, those are the composting methods that we use in the wellness garden that I wanted to cover. My phone is on 5%, and I think we're over time, so we have to go. But thank you for joining us today. Did you have any final thoughts, Nelly?
No, well, thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions, you guys can always just leave a comment, or once the live is posted, you can just comment something.
Yeah, or you can use the Ask a Master Gardener feature on our website. That is still a thing. So feel free to go over to the Magrum Center website and navigate over to the Ask a Master Gardener page and submit your questions for us there. I believe next week is soil health. So we'll be talking all about soil health next week, ways to improve soil health, ways to maintain soil health, the soil health principles, the do's and don'ts for healthy soil. So stay tuned for that. That is going to be a very information-packed episode of Live in the Wellness Garden. A lot of valuable material, especially if you're a new gardener, because healthy soil is the foundation for healthy plants, and composting is one piece of that. So we covered composting today. We want to incorporate compost into our soil. One of the best ways to improve soil health is to compost. So we'll be talking about the other ways to do that during the next live. So thank you very much for joining us today.
We'll see you guys next week.
See you guys next week at 10. All right. Have a good one, everyone.